Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, a deep dive into the newest federal guidance for educating students with disabilities. We did this webinar back on October 20th and got a lot of requests for a recording of it. So we're going to go ahead and redo the webinar and record it and make that available. There should be live captioning available on the recording. If you're unable to get that, you can pull up the transcript that will come with the recording and do that side by side with the video. So we want to make sure it's accessible to everyone. So I am Wendy Tucker with the Center for Learner Equity. And before we begin, I just want to quickly go over our organization and what our mission is. We are a national nonprofit that's committed to ensuring that students with disabilities, particularly those in under-resourced communities, have the quality educational opportunities and choices they need to thrive and to learn. And we do this through 4 areas of work. We document and communicate facts. We inform policy, which is what we're talking about today. We develop coalitions and we build capacity. I love talking about the work we do, and I'm happy to do that at length with anyone. Reach out to me, but I really want to spend the hour of this webinar on the content. So I am going to move on here, but again, would love to chat with anyone who's interested. Or you can go to our website, centerforlearnerequity.org, and learn lots about us. Quickly about me, again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but as I said, I'm the Senior Director of Policy at the Center. I live in beautiful Nashville, Tennessee. That's a picture of the city on the river. To the right is my family. That's my husband and my 2 daughters. And my daughter in the picture on the far right is my 19-year-old with a disability who led me to this work of disability advocacy. And then on the bottom left, I am a lawyer. And I currently serve as a commissioner on the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission, and I formerly served on our State Board of Education. So I mentioned that I am a lawyer, so this is where lawyers give a disclaimer. I am a lawyer. I am not your lawyer. So if you need legal advice, you should consult your lawyer. So everything I say here, none of it is legal advice. Lawyers love to give opinions, and I have lots of opinions, but none of this is actual legal advice. So what we're going to do today is first, I want to just talk quickly about what the big picture of this new federal guidance, what it is, what it covers, how it's structured. Then we'll talk a little bit about what I think of as sort of the typical federal guidance pieces of it that are kind of general reminders of the law, and then some virtual specific guidance related to the circumstances that we're all in with the COVID-19 pandemic. After that, I want to spend a little more time getting into some of the more what I think are interesting issues in this guidance, issues around mental and physical wellness and how those impact a free, appropriate public education, issues around least restrictive environment and that legal requirement during COVID. And then finally, something that I think a lot of people have been waiting for guidance on, the issue of compensatory services and appropriate goal setting and how those things feed into each other. So we're going to do that. I'm going to try to stop after each section. There were questions asked in the live version of this, so I have those questions, and I'm going to try to at least address those questions at the end of each section. So the first, I want to talk about the big picture a little bit. So federal guidance, it has a nice long name, a very federal way of approaching things. A return to school roadmap, the development and implementation of individualized education programs in the least restrictive environment under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So you will, if you have this webinar, you will have the slides, and anything underlined here is a link. So there's a link to that guidance. You can also go on the Federal Department of Ed's website and find it, but it was issued by the Office of Special Education on September 30th of this year. So about 3 weeks before I did the live version of this. It is 41 pages long. It is a hefty document. It is in question and answer format and sort of organized around 8 topics. Its focus is mainly on the IDEA, the law part B, so school age students, ages 3 to 21. There's some discussion of the early childhood part C of IDEA that deals with infants and toddlers. And because this office doesn't oversee civil rights, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act are not covered, but they are mentioned. And it's actually, we'll talk about it, it's actually important that they are mentioned here. I mentioned it's Q&A and 8 topics. I sort of restructured it in my own way to be able to talk about the issues the way I wanted to talk about them. So their structure is slightly different. So the overarching theme of the guidance is follow the rules. It is a message that is, I don't think, a surprise to anyone who has been following the Federal Department of Education during this entire pandemic. The language in the guidance, and I quote some here, the department repeats and emphasizes, notwithstanding the challenges of COVID-19, children retain their rights to receive appropriate services. They also note, and I talked about this a second ago, that although it's beyond the scope of this document, public agencies that get federal funding are reminded of their obligation to comply with Section 504. So they're saying, we are responsible for making sure that schools comply with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, but remember, you also need to honor the civil rights of students and people with disabilities. And so the language all through the guidance is those reminders. And again, it's not a surprise. Back in April of 2020, then Secretary DeVos was offered an opportunity to request substantive waivers of the requirements of the law. Congress asked her if she wanted any waivers, and she said no. And so this is sort of the visual we like to use, and we like to say there's no pandemic exception to the requirement to provide a free, appropriate public education to students with disabilities. And so again, that language was not a shock. So I said the overarching message is follow the law, but there was an interesting sort of layer over that. There's really in this guidance an additional emphasis on quality. A free, appropriate public education, obviously the inference is quality is part of being appropriate, but there is a real sort of depth to the conversation and to the language used and to the analysis used in this guidance around that quality piece. And I'll point that out as we go through, but I think that's something that was really interesting to me and something that I wanted to highlight. So after this section, we were asked, will it be recorded? Here we are recording. Can we get a copy of the PowerPoint? That's also going to be provided. And a substantive question was asking how the guidance or future guidance would apply to long-term teacher vacancies, which is something that's, people are struggling with around the country, in inability to fill teacher roles, particularly around higher needs subjects like special education. And my response to that is that I think the hope is that giving this guidance, giving these real detailed examples of how to do this with quality will help keep educators in their roles and help, stop this sort of loss of educators and maybe even drive new people, more people to come into the field. It might be just wishful thinking, but that's my hope around how this guidance is structured. So I mentioned that we would talk about general and virtual specific guidance next. I want to take a second to point out federal guidance is not new law. It's not new requirements. It is the Federal Department of Education's interpretation of what the law requires in specific circumstances. And so much of federal guidance that comes out is this very general and then sort of how this applies in a specific situation kind of guidance, which is what this sort of bucket of the guidance that we're going to talk about quickly is. Even though it's not new requirements, it is interesting to see what the department chooses to put in guidance, what they choose to highlight, because it is, to me, telling us the things they're hearing about, the concerns that are there, the challenges that are in the field. And so it's not just that these are reminders of the law and how it applies. It's, these are reminders that apparently they're feeling are necessary. So let's look at sort of the general stuff. They go through in the guidance and remind people IEPs have to be in place at the start of the year. They go through the law that is very specific in IDEA about what happens when students transfer between districts or even between states. Like what happens to the prior IEP? What are the requirements for transferring it? What are the requirements at the new school for either abiding by that IEP or creating a new one? All of that is what lawyers call black letter law, right? It's all in the statute, and they do this reminder of that. They do a reminder about who has to attend IEP meetings, who can be excused by written, by written permission, and who needs to be there. They talk about parent participation, the need and the requirement of the district to accommodate parents and make sure that they are able to participate, that mutually convenient times are picked for the meetings, that parents who can't participate in person are able to participate in some other way if they need interpreters. They really highlight the importance of parent participation. They talk about extended school year services and remind schools, districts, states that they could still offer extended school year. And they reiterate something they said in the earlier COVID guidance, that it doesn't just have to be summer, that extended school year can include other breaks. It can include after school. You can be creative to try to fill in that time. And then they talk about the fact that IEP team members, when they need to, can call additional IEP meetings, that there's no limitation to one meeting a year. Now, I think all of this tells us that there have been real challenges with holding IEP meetings, that there is a lot of mobility during COVID with students, moving, losing their homes, losing family members, and going between schools, districts, and states. And that there has been a real challenge in making sure that all the people who need to be in the meetings are in the meetings and able to meaningfully participate. So that general guidance, again, this is all straight out of the law, all the things that they say here, except for the extended school year where they talk about how you can be creative about it. But it does show that there are challenges and that there have been challenges. And then they talk with some guidance about sort of these virtual specific issues. They talk about the need for IEPs to be amended outside of the annual IEP process. And so if an IEP for last year, school year, was written with students completely virtual, you may need to have an amendment, not wait if it was written in, January, not wait till January, till the year is up to rewrite that, but come in and have an amendment so that you can address what the actual circumstances are currently. They talk about assistive technology, and IDEA has language in it about assistive technology. So none of this is new, but they highlight in the guidance the fact that, devices are now just common. Like students have devices, whether they're in person or online or both. Devices have become much more mainstream in the school system, and how you need to be assessing the needs of students. Do they need to continue to use that device? Are there other devices that they need that they don't have? And you need to provide those. They talk about the fact that training and technical assistance are required for educators, students, and maybe even families, if the families need it for the student to be able to receive their free, appropriate public education. And then they remind states and schools and districts that there is funding available for this, that there's plenty of money available for assistive technology purposes. They talk in this guidance about contingency plans, which is something that came up in the earlier COVID guidance. And they suggest and recommend, sure, if you have an IEP meeting and your students are in person, it is smart to have in that IEP what happens if the school goes remote or if the student has to be quarantined for a period of time. And so to have that contingency plan in place so everyone knows how things will look differently. FAPE still has to be provided, but what it looks like when those contingencies happen. They talked about virtual IEP team meetings. A lot of parents have said, this has actually been a good thing about COVID. We've been able to participate more. It's been easier to be a part of the team. And so they note that you can continue to do that by agreement. If the parents are fine with virtual, the school is fine with virtual, you can do it. Or if there is a safety necessity to continue with virtual meetings. And then they talk about virtual dispute resolutions, whether it's due process hearings or other dispute resolution processes. And they say it can be done by agreement again, or if state law allows it to be done virtually, even without agreement, then you can do it by state law. So they really kind of look at these things that are in IDEA and say, in this new virtual world, this is how we need to be thinking about these things. So those were sort of the more traditional pieces of guidance. I had a few questions that were asked then that I just want to address. One was if there was any shift of changes to the role students play in IEP meetings. Student driven IEPs are a big thing in parts of the country. There is nothing in the guidance about that. But I think IDEA certainly supports that, and students, are welcome to play a role in their IEP meeting and may, but there's nothing in the guidance about that. There was also a question about parent training specific to the technology, and it asked if a parent requests to be trained on a new product the district is going to use, does the district have a responsibility to provide the training? So again, opinion, not legal advice, but the law is pretty clear that if a device is needed for a student to receive a free, appropriate public education, and if the parents, if the student needs to be able to use that device, at home, for example, and the parents need to be able to support them, especially in this sort of hybrid or COVID, online environment, then I would say absolutely the school would have an obligation to train the parents on how to use that. An example I could think of might be a device that the school uses for a student who needs read aloud. And the student has homework that requires read aloud, or the student is, hybrid, or the student has medical issues where they're home and sometimes doing online learning at home, or whatever the circumstance might be. If the parents aren't able to use that device and the student needs it and needs to have the parents support their use of that device, then yes, I would submit that would be required under FAPE. Okay. Now we're going to switch to some of the more sort of the more unusual, sort of deeper issues that the guidance covered. So I grouped these two things, mental and physical wellness issues and FAPE, together. And this is really two separate issues, but I think they're interconnected. One is social, emotional, mental health issues, and then the other is students with underlying medical conditions that make them at higher risk if they were to contract COVID. So we're going to look at both of those, and then I'm going to go through a couple questions that we got asked. So social, emotional, behavior, and mental health needs of students is something that the guidance spends a good bit of time on. And in the guidance, there is an assumption, which I think is a fair assumption, that COVID-19 has caused increased needs for supports in these areas. And it's sort of twofold. It's one, students who had the needs before COVID, a student with a behavior plan or counseling in their IEP who didn't receive those services because of COVID. And then you have students whose issues around these needs arose during COVID because of the trauma that they may have experienced. So you've got sort of these two, and sometimes it's both in one student. A student had underlying social, emotional, behavioral, mental health needs, and then now there's trauma on top of that, and they have additional needs. So the guidance says IEP teams should evaluate whether services were provided during the pandemic and assess student experiences that could have negatively impacted them. So they're basically saying, like, did they get what they were supposed to get if they had something that they were supposed to get? And then what has happened where they might need more? And the guidance, I talked about the quality piece in this guidance, and this is an example of that. The guidance actually goes into examples of ways you might address these types of needs. And they go through each kind of category of services and supports that can be provided under IDEA. So under special education and related services, they talk about the fact that you could add counseling services or social skill instruction or explicit instruction on how to manage stress, anxiety, or depression. Like those could be in a student's IEP to address some of these needs. For supplementary aids and services, you could add consults. You could bring in a behavior specialist to consult with the teacher to figure out how to support the student. You could give access to a counselor. So it may not be direct counseling services. It may not be, 30 minutes 3 times a week with the school counselor, but it could be if the student is exhibiting signs of having challenges with their mental health concerns, then they're able to go to the counselor. And then there could be access to specific targeted strategies that might help for a specific student. In program modifications, they talk about adapting homework assignments, adapting reading passages to meet the needs of the student. And I think here they're talking about meet the needs if the student has lost, learning loss, like if they've lost skills, but also the needs that may come up as far as anxiety, just feeling unable to sit down and do that amount of work, being able to modify so that you're able to support the students' mental health needs. And then they also talk about supports for school personnel. We talked early on about the issue of teacher shortages. And so here they're talking about, like, how do we help the school help the students? And they suggest things like training on positive behavior supports, universal design for learning. And so these examples in this guidance I found really interesting. And I thought it was great that they weren't just saying, here's what the law requires you to do. They're making suggestions on how you can do that in a real quality way. There's a real emphasis, again, back to quality, on implementation. They talk a lot in the guidance about quality functional behavior analyses and behavior intervention plans. They encourage the schools to analyze and effectively address causes of behavior. A lot of students have functional behavior analyses, behavior intervention plans. I think the anticipation is there may need to be a lot more of that to address this increased need. And so they really talk about the fact that it needs to be done well. They talk about how the special educators and related service providers have to be appropriately licensed and trained. While we're experiencing this teacher shortage crisis, you have to make sure that the educators in the building and the related service providers in the building have the skills they need to be able to meet the needs of the students. And then this is something I hear about from parents a lot, that paraprofessionals and classroom assistants can assist, but they have to be appropriately trained and supervised. And so there's this real emphasis on quality. Like, this is hard stuff. Here are some ways to do it, and please make sure the people you have doing it know what they're doing. They also really, and this is a quote from the guidance, they are strongly discouraging just a default to discipline. I think everyone watching this knows that students with disabilities are disproportionately subjected to harsh discipline, suspension, expulsion, restraint, seclusion, referral to law enforcement, right? The data on that historically for decades has been terrible. And so I think they're really mindful of that and don't want that to get even worse in these circumstances. And so they say schools should avoid routinely using discipline to address behavior, should consider developing, revising, or ensuring the provision of, like, if you already have it, make sure you're using it, positive behavior interventions and supports and other strategies. So they really are trying to say, like, if kids are misbehaving, figure out the source of the behavior and address that root cause, and don't just, send them to in-school suspension or out-of-school suspension or whatever the usual harsh disciplines are. So this is a moment where I there's a link in this to this, but I give a pitch for a document that we co-authored early in the pandemic with the National Center for Learning Disabilities. We wrote this white paper on disproportionate discipline in COVID-19, and in it gives suggestions to schools on how they can approach reentry into the building in a way that does not feed into this disproportionality that already exists. So we would love for any of you to read that, and hopefully you would get some ideas from that. And then the department also recognizing that need. I think the day of the live version of this webinar, they released this very thick report supporting child and student social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health needs. And again, there's a link here. It is, I don't remember now, but 100 and something pages long. It has some great resources in it. It is not special education or disability specific, but students with disabilities and their needs are mentioned. And so there are pieces of it that do apply. But I think it's a great resource, and I highly recommend that you review it and see what you can get from that. And now I'm going to flip to the other piece of this physical mental health needs, and this is FAPE for students with underlying medical conditions. And this is a real issue around the country, and we'll talk about this a little bit. So they point out in the guidance that the law is clear that eligible students with disabilities who need school-related health services are entitled to them as part of FAPE. And before COVID, you can think about it as, it could be things like students with diabetes or students with mental health needs, any sort of health related needs, if they need that to access their free appropriate public education, then they're entitled to it. They also point out in the guidance that IEP teams can include, whether the parents suggested or the district suggested, healthcare professionals. They say a child's medical provider can be a part of the IEP team in having these conversations. The school nurse, someone from the school's medical office. And so they're really encouraging, like, bring in the people who know what the student needs, including people who know what they need as far as their medical requirements. They talk about the fact that if a parent or other IEP team member believes COVID-19 prevention strategies are necessary for FAPE. Now we're talking about masking, distancing, hand washing, whatever those strategies might be. The IEP team must consider, they don't say should, they say must consider whether and to what extent the measures are necessary. The decision has to be based on student-specific information, and any of those measures that the team says are necessary for FAPE has to be included in the IEP. And so all of that is completely aligned with IDEA and with the case law about medical needs being met as part of FAPE. But this is a big deal that they're saying, like, if a student needs social distancing, if a student needs masking in their classroom, and they need it to obtain FAPE, it's in their IEP, and then it has to happen. So what does this mean for states, cities, and schools with mask policy prohibitions, right? There are changes often, but I think there are 10 states, maybe, there may be 11 now, locations around the country where there is either a statute or a policy or an executive order that limits the ability of districts or schools to require masks in their buildings. Some of it's a blanket limit, some of it allows opt-outs, whatever those are. What does that guidance mean for that? Well, they talk about it in the guidance. And the short answer is it's a problem. And here's the language from the guidance, which is incredibly strong. State and local laws, rules, regulations, or policies that have the effect of improper limiting the ability of the IEP team to address the school-related health needs of a child with a disability, or the ability of the group of knowledgeable people to propose an appropriate placement in the least restrictive environment for children with disabilities who have these needs, would be a violation of IDEA. So they're saying if you have those blanket things, so this IEP team can't put in the IEP, all the kids in the classroom have to be masked, or all the kids in the classroom have to be 6 feet apart if they're not masked, or whatever that might be, you are violating federal law. That is strong language. I think it's aligned with the law, but that is very strong language. So the next question, can IEP teams just handle this by changing a student's placement, right? I don't, but assume there's a child with an underlying metabolic disorder that if she were to get COVID-19, she would be at risk of getting very, very ill or dying. The IEP team has determined that the best way to give her, the only way to give her FAPE and to protect her is for everyone in her environment to be masked. You are in a state where the law is you can't require kids to wear masks in schools. So can the IEP team just say, well, until COVID passes, we're going to put her online, or we're going to put her in a room with an educator and a parapro. We're going to put her in a much more restrictive environment because we need to do that medically because of this law. Well, the short answer to that is no. When the general education placement is appropriate for the child's educational needs, so like before COVID, was this where you wanted this child, and was this where this child was able to receive FAPE? Was this the least restrictive environment, the appropriate environment for them? So the language here, Congress specifically enacted IDEA in part to rectify exclusion of kids with disabilities from classrooms. And then this language I thought was really powerful. Otherwise, the parent's left with two equally unacceptable choices: an in-person educational placement that puts their child at increased risk of severe illness, or exclusion from school. And so they say, no, you can't do that. Like, you have to You can't do that. If the child needs these things in the least restrictive environment, you have to provide it. So what does enforcement of this look like, right? Policy is great on paper and it's great to be strong and say no, but what do you do? So they talked about that in the guidance too. And the short answer is it depends on who's enforcing it. They note in the guidance that parents can use IDEA's dispute resolution processes. They can request mediation, they can file for due process. And that's great. But for those of us who've been involved in those processes, we know that is a long process, even with strict timelines that are, even if you stick to the strict timelines, and you still have a child who every day is either missing class or at risk. They also talk about the Department of Education's role at the federal level, and they say they're going to monitor, they're going to look at publicly available information and stakeholder input, including parents. They're going to offer technical assistance to districts that aren't following these requirements, that aren't providing what's needed for FAPE for these students. And then they say for places where that's not working, where it's not accepted or it's not working, they're going to use, and this is their quote, the department will use, quote, all its enforcement options, including referral to the Department of Justice. So they're taking a really strong stand on this. We'll see how it unfolds and what actually happens as far as enforcement. But the language in the guidance is clearly not just this is what you're supposed to do, but this is what you're supposed to do and we're going to hold you to it. So we'll see. And then, the last question on this, and then I'll go to some of the questions that were asked, is this what all those lawsuits are about, right? I think however many states there are with these prohibitions, there are lawsuits in all of those states. And in most of those, the lawsuits are by families of students with disabilities. And so is this the same thing? The answer to that is not exactly. This is a parallel issue, but it's really a separate issue. Most of those cases are based on civil rights. They're based on access violations. The Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504, they're saying that my child, because of their underlying health condition that you are not accommodating, they do not have access to their education. So they're not saying it's a violation of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And, they're not doing that. There's good reason for that. First of all, there's strong arguments that these are civil rights violations, but also if it is under IDEA, that law requires that you go through all these administrative processes before you can actually file in court. And so in a lot of those cases that are still working their way through courts, the arguments from the states have been, this is actually IDEA and they haven't exhausted their remedies. And I think in only one state has that argument worked. I think in Florida, the court found an exhaustion argument had merit and dismissed the case for them to go through the IDEA process. So it's not the same thing, but I think an important note is those lawsuits may offer opportunities for teams to be able to appropriately address the needs of students with underlying medical conditions. An example, and we'll see how this unfolds now with new legislation that just happened in a special session, but here in Tennessee, 3 of these lawsuits have been filed in 3 cities, Memphis, Knoxville, and Williamson County. In each of those cities, these are federal court lawsuits, civil rights allegations, the federal court has ordered that the opt-out that was state law not be allowed and that mask mandates be in effect, essentially, in those districts. And so in those districts today, anyway, and as things wind through the courts, things change, obviously, but today, IEP teams in those districts will be able to say in their IEP of a child with an underlying medical condition who needs this for FAPE, that they will be in a classroom where all of the students in contact with them are masked because they're able to actually do that. And so in some ways, while it's a separate issue, it really does help IEP teams follow the law. Okay, that was a lot. So I am going to look at a couple of the questions. How do we address a situation where a student has the COVID-19 accommodations in their IEP, so masks, but there are other students who have doctor's approval due to their own health difficulties to not wear a mask? And then a similar question, What about students because of their disability can't wear a mask? How do schools balance these? Those are great questions. Earlier guidance from the Office of Civil Rights talked about the fact that there are students who may not be able to wear masks, may not be able to socially distance, may not be able to follow these protocols due to their own disabilities, and how schools were going to have to figure out how to balance school safety with the rights of that student or those students with disabilities. And I think that continues to be true here. And so, I think it'll be very circumstance dependent, which is why having an individualized education plan is really important. But I think things like, making sure if there are students who can't wear masks, are you able to keep social distance from this student? And I think in places where mask requirements are the rule, and then people have medical exceptions or exceptions that are, make sense, it's a lot easier to do that than in places where there's no way that you can require the general population to wear a mask. And so schools are just going to have to figure those things out. And I think the more IEP teams can come together, bring folks together, have those conversations about how to meet those needs, the more creative ways there will be around that. And there's another question that I punted to the end of this, but just for the sake of reliving what we did, there was a question about what should schools do if parents are asking for a more restrictive placement out of COVID fears. So we talked about how IEP teams can't say, oh, we're going to put you in this room, or we're going to move you to online. So we're going to talk about that here. That's a great segue to this least restrictive environment in the COVID era section. So I think hopefully everyone who's watching knows that the law requires that to the maximum extent possible, students with disabilities, here it is. Sorry, I forgot I had it on a slide. This is from IDEA. To the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with their non-disabled peers. And you don't remove kids with disabilities from the general education environment unless the use of supplementary aids and services can't be achieved satisfactorily. So education with that use. So basically, you can't just say, oh, it's hard to educate this child in the general education environment, so I'm moving them. You have to figure out what supports and services you can give them to help them succeed in that environment and make meaningful progress on their IEP goals. And when that doesn't work is when you can move them to a more restrictive environment. And the law requires a full continuum. So the presumed placement for all kids is general education. And then as those needs get greater, you can go all the way up to a much more restrictive environment. And so that's the law pre-COVID, and that continues to be the law during COVID. So in the guidance, there's a real emphasis on the importance of least restrictive environment. Again, they talk about Congress expressing concerns about children with disabilities being excluded from public schools. They say IDEA has continually reflected a strong preference for educating children with disabilities in regular classes with appropriate aids and supports. And so they really emphasize that LRE, least restrictive environment, is important. It's not just a box to check. It's a really important thing. They say in the guidance that the state has obligations. The state has to ensure that teachers and administrators in districts know the law. Like, the state is responsible for them understanding the least restrictive environment requirement. The state is responsible for providing technical assistance and training as necessary to make sure that they are aware of it and that they're able to do it. And the state is required to monitor to make sure that it's happening. They also say in the guidance that given COVID, the state should look at how they're ensuring least restrictive environment to make sure that it's covering the things that have happened during the pandemic, right? Make sure that your compliance checks are adequately capturing the remote piece of things that has happened that now is, we hadn't thought about before COVID, but is now happening, to make sure that least restrictive environment is still being given. So where is virtual instruction on the continuum, right? We talked about you have to have the continuum, and the general education environment is the least restrictive. Where is virtual? Well, they talk about that in the guidance. And the short answer is it depends. They note that prior to COVID, special education virtually was one of the most restrictive environments, when you're looking at that continuum. And then they say virtual learning provided during the pandemic may be deemed less restrictive if it's available to all children and provides children with disabilities meaningful opportunities to be educated and to interact with non-disabled peers in the regular education environment. So it might be less restrictive if everybody is, it's open to everybody. It's not just the kids with disabilities go online and the gen ed kids go in the building, right? And even with it's everybody, there has to still be this ability to meaningfully engage with your non-disabled peers. So that's strong language on LRE. So I think this was the question that I transitioned on. What if a parent says, I don't want my kid in the building? Maybe they're in a state where mask requirements aren't allowed. Maybe, maybe they're just nervous. Maybe they have their own vulnerabilities at home, or for whatever reason, or maybe their kid thrived in the virtual setting last year and they're like, I want to keep my child in the virtual setting. This is the one piece of the guidance that I actually found troubling. I think it's aligned with the black letter of the law, but I don't think it really matches some of the other stuff that's been said. So the short answer is it's confusing. They say if virtual instruction is offered to all students, districts must ensure it's available to students with disabilities whose needs can be met virtually, and it must include an IEP that provides services and supports for the child to receive FAPE. And then they have this strange note, in my opinion, about home instruction, or homebound, as some states call it, and that it must also be available. So technically, this is probably aligned with IDEA, right? If you give it to everybody, you have to give it to students with disabilities. My concern is, what about the student who, they talked about earlier in the guidance, who has an underlying health condition? Either the IEP team the school has refused, IEP team has refused, the state law doesn't allow, whatever it is, the child can't safely receive FAPE in the in-person environment, but there's no, Tennessee is a state, there's no virtual allowed under the law in the public schools. Like, what happens for that student? Are you saying that because it's not available to the general education population, you don't have to make it available to students with disabilities? I could see that type of scenario where due process gets filed and a court determines that FAPE for that child has to be in a virtual environment and that the school has to provide it. I could see that happening and being aligned with IDEA. I am just concerned that for that to happen, it appears a family would have to go through the due process to be able to get there. And so that's why I found this answer confusing and concerning. And the note about home instruction, IDEA requires all states to have homebound or home instruction as an option in that continuum. They do not define what that looks like, what those requirements are, how that determination is made. That's all state law driven. And so maybe there's a state somewhere in our country that does homebound in a really robust way. I'm not aware of it. All of the state laws I'm aware of on homebound, it is a pretty minimal piece of education, and it is meant to be sort of short-term, after surgery or some, maybe a mental health challenge where the student needs some time. And so it's not meant to be robust FAPE. And so it is concerning to me that is noted here, particularly after the length of time that we've lost for students to be able to suggest that home instruction might somehow meet these needs. And so those are some of my lingering concerns. This was the same question. Is homebound the only option if you're not able to get FAPE in a non-virtual setting? And is that really FAPE? So that was a lot. I had a couple questions here. One was you have to have the virtual has to be open to all students. The question was, is the reverse true? In my state, children with IEPs that require services outside of gen ed are being barred from virtual instruction, which is otherwise available to all students. Again, not legal advice, but my opinion, that is a violation of IDEA. It's certainly a violation of this guidance interpretation of IDEA. And then the other question that was asked was if virtual is not offered to gen ed, do you still have to provide it for students with IEPs? And that was that analysis we just went through. Okay, I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to look at my watch. So the sort of last chunk, which is sort of the thing that has been a source of a lot of conversation and concern, is around compensatory services. So we're going to talk about compensatory, and I have this as appropriate goals and compensatory services. These are really two different topics, but they are really connected in the guidance. So I wanted to connect them here because we'll walk through it, but there's a conversation about how the appropriate goals and where the goals are should help feed into comp ed. So in the guidance, they talk about how IEP teams have to consider the adverse impacts of the pandemic on each student with a disability and look to see if they have new or different needs. And then they talk about, again, this goes to the quality thing. They give a list of things that you could consider, but you're not limited to. Lost skills, lack of expected progress, present levels of performance after the closures or after a switch to virtual, an assessment of all areas of need, including new ones. And we talked, an example is sort of new mental health needs, but there could be other new needs that arise after the closures. COVID prevention measures that are being implemented to provide healthy learning environments. The guidance talks a lot about the fact that students need optimal learning environments in order to learn, and that health and safety are a big part of that. And so they say, you got to look and see, like, how has this pandemic impacted students? And then the question was, may IEP teams amend goals once you've done this analysis to reflect a decline in the knowledge and skills of students due to COVID? So when I first read that, the advocate in me was like, no, you don't reduce expectations when students haven't met them. Like, you don't just say, well, they're reading at a third grade level now, so we're just going to give them third grade. And so I had concerns about this question. But when I read further and saw where they were going with it, it made sense. So let's look at that. Their short answer is yes, actually. And they talk about how IEPs are meant to provide meaningful opportunities for appropriate academic and functional progress in light of the child's circumstances, and that the teams have to accurately determine where the student is, what their present levels are, in order to develop measurable goals that give the child the opportunity to meet challenging objectives. So they basically say, whether the goals are too low or too high, either one of those isn't appropriate, that you have to figure out where the student is and then have goals that are challenging for them, but that are appropriate for them. And so if a student has lost skills, backslid, stood still, whatever it might be, you need to look at the goals that were in the IEP and see if they continue to be appropriate. And you do the same analysis for transition age students. So for students who over 18, between 18 and 21, who are doing, post-secondary or job readiness or just learning how to live independently in the environment. They say for IEP teams need to consider whether their needs have changed, whether their goals need to be modified, and then they need to modify their goals as appropriate. And they even say for transition students, the pre-employment transition services that were disrupted might need to be repeated if needs weren't met. These are kids who may, absent the COVID challenges, could be in job training programs, or could be doing internships as part of their transition program, or could be going to work development places. Some are going out into the community, learning how to find groceries in a grocery store and pay for them, learning how to use public transit. These are all things that 18 to 21-year-olds need to know how to do to live independently and hopefully get employment. And when the world shut down and they didn't have an opportunity to learn those skills, the guidance says you might need to do it again, might need to repeat that guidance. And so that part of the guidance for 3 through 21 really feeds into compensatory services. So what is comp ed? These are educational services that are beyond what's in the IEP, and it results from a failure or an inability of a school to provide appropriate services. And historically, they're not in IDEA. They are a judicially created remedy for a failure to provide FAPE. Historically, because they're a judicially created remedy, judges get involved when people don't agree, right? When there's wrongdoing alleged. And so historically, compensatory services has sort of meant bad acting, like the school district did, behaved poorly, did not do what they were supposed to do, which is part of the reason there's so much controversy around using the term now. But it's an equitable remedy to remediate the loss of FAPE for a period of time. It's been, I mentioned it's on the slide here, it's been ordered by courts in due process and states when state complaints are filed in their complaint procedures historically. And so I noted this, but I think it's important. It's not in IDEA. You will not find the words compensatory services in IDEA, but you will find it in case law on IDEA. So who decides whether compensatory services are needed and what extent? This is a big question. And, like I said, historically, it was courts or a state through a complaint process. But this, I think, is a piece of the guidance that is super important. The short answer is the IEP teams using any relevant standards applicable in their jurisdiction. So you have to know what the sort of standards are in that state, in that district. But they talk about the department has a long-standing position that IEP teams are the appropriate vehicle for addressing the need for and extent of compensatory ed, and that it's an appropriate proactive mitigation measure to address the needs of the child, basically without having to go through a court process, right? That the team that knows the student, that comes together to figure out what the student needs, what their goals are, where they are, what they need to achieve those goals, is the same team that should figure out if they need compensatory. And it says in the guidance, they should assess the need for an extent of compensatory using the same individualized, child-centered analysis that they use for team meetings when they're deciding the contents of the IEP, right? What are the concerns? What are the present levels? What has happened? And then they actually, again, back to that quality thing I talked about, they say teams should consider input from previous teachers and service providers to learn about skills and progress levels pre-pandemic. So, some of these students have not been in a school building without, a mask or a lot of these COVID precautions for 20 months now, right? And so going back to the fifth grader's third grade teacher and saying, where was she in these areas of need? How was her progress? What were the things that worked with her is something that they suggest in this guidance. And then they talk about how we need to deliver the additional services. If compensatory services are needed, deliver them in a way that doesn't diminish the opportunity to interact with their non-disabled peers and participate in extracurriculars and other non-academic activities. They're basically saying, you have a child with a disability, they've lost a lot of learning opportunity. Don't just say every free moment you're going to be over here. When everybody else is at lunch, you're going to be over here learning. Figure out ways to help get them those compensatory services without making it a really segregated environment without opportunities to do the robust inclusion, the meaningful inclusion that is so critical for students with disabilities. So it's really thoughtful analysis, in my opinion. And then they talk about the factors that you can consider. They talk about first look to see if there's law or guidance locally or at the state. But, if you don't have those, think about the present levels, talk to the parents, think about what the anticipated levels were without COVID and where they actually are. Look at their previous rate of progress. Like, how were they moving forward before COVID? Look at the frequency and duration of services and supports that were provided prior to COVID. Like, if they were making great progress and they were getting these services, think about how you can then interpret that to maybe we need to, bump up if they were making really great progress in speech and they got the speech 30 minutes 3 times a week, maybe we need to bump that up, or just look at what was working and how much you were using and try to figure out a way as a team to craft these compensatory services. They also say that the state has a role. They have to ensure that districts take appropriate action to mitigate the failure or inability to provide FAPE. Like, states are responsible to making sure districts are doing these analyses. They can provide guidance, and they can ensure that they're all aware of applicable case law, of consent decrees that may apply and other precedent that may apply in their area. So they really are, and of this guidance, really, like they're saying the state needs to make sure the districts are doing what they're supposed to do. And so then they talk about circumstances where compensatory services might be appropriate. And again, this goes back to that quality piece. They're not just saying, here's the law, here's how it applies. They're saying, here's some things you might consider, which again, I think is really helpful in this guidance. And so they talk about a number of circumstances. If an initial evaluation and IEP development were delayed, so the student never got an IEP because the world shut down, right? If services provided weren't appropriate to meet the student's needs. If it's a student who needs hands-on supports, occupational therapy, physical therapy, feeding supports, learning how to eat, learning how to walk, things where you have to be in person and social distancing is impossible. Like those would not have happened through no one's fault. And so if those didn't happen, if some or all of the IEP couldn't be implemented with the delivery methods available during the pandemic, right? If you have a student, if the school moved to remote and you have a student who cannot learn for whatever reason, cognitive, visual impairment, whatever the reasons might be, can't learn in a virtual setting, right? So you can't do what you would do in person virtually. Or if meaningful services to facilitate transition from high school weren't provided. I talked about that, the training programs, the internships, that sort of stuff. So these are answers that they actually list as possibilities. How do you pay for compensatory? They talk about that. You can use state and local funds. You can use IDEA specific funds that the American Recovery Plan, there's a bit of IDEA specific dollars in the American Recovery Plan. So they talk about those two buckets of dollars. It's important to note, and I put this in the slides, that if you use those, then you have to be aware of the maintenance of effort implications moving forward. And maintenance of effort could be a whole webinar, but you can't reduce the amount of effort or amount of funding you put in for special ed, is a very basic way of saying it. And so if you use those dollars, then you have to be aware of that. But there was a lot of money given in these ESSER, these governor's relief packages, all of these COVID relief packages that were general education dollars that can be used to support students with disabilities. And if you use those to supplement the local dollars, you can't use it to replace the local dollars, then that spending doesn't impact maintenance of effort because those are one-time dollars that you can use on top. And so the short answer from me is for compensatory is use those dollars, like have some of those dollars set aside, prioritize compensatory services for students with disabilities. And then for students who've aged out or graduated out of special ed, what about those students? The short answer is it doesn't matter. Compensatory can extend past eligibility. This is a big deal. In some states, there have been laws or policies changed to extend eligibility for students with disabilities automatically, or if IEP teams determine it past the age that they would normally age out. But this says for compensatory, you don't need that law. Because compensatory is to remedy a failure to provide FAPE, it can be used to address the needs of students who are beyond eligibility. It can take the form of additional period of eligibility. And there's case law where I think there's a case where a 26-year-old is receiving services because of a violation of FAPE. And so it doesn't matter. You can do comp ed for those students and probably should be looking first at those students' needs because they are aged out before you lose them. And so I think this may be one of the last questions. Can we address this need through extended school year or recovery services, right? So we talked about ESY and then recovery services. A lot of states are using these ESSER dollars and they're doing summer programs or reading programs or general recovery for all students. And the answer to this question is probably not. ESY has different standards. They're defined in state law and different purposes than compensatory. Recovery services are great if they're offered to all students or even to kids with disabilities. If they're not based on the specific process in IDEA for looking to see whether FAPE has been provided, then the guidance, and this is a quote from the guidance, likely would not be, then those services likely would not be considered compensatory. And so the lesson here, in my opinion, is recovery services are great, but make sure that you are making an allotment of some of those dollars for students with disabilities and compensatory services. And then finally, the remedies for disputes about compensatory are the same remedies families have under IDEA. They can file state complaints. If an IEP team says no, you don't get compensatory, or you get compensatory, but there's a disagreement about how much, state complaints, mediation, due process. I think the hope of the U.S. Department of Ed, which is a hope I share, is that by giving this, by emphasizing that an IEP team has the power to do this, they are going to avoid a lot of these disputes because that team has a relationship, can come together, knows the student, and can make those individualized determinations. That's the hope. So some final thoughts, and then I think I had one or two more questions that I addressed. This guidance shows the department clearly recognized students with disabilities have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. They are standing by their decision. They're standing strong to hold states, districts, and schools accountable under the law for providing a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment, even during a pandemic. They clearly want families and schools to be collaborative, to work together to best support the needs of students. And they are really emphasizing quality rather than just talking about compliance. And so this is why I was really excited about this guidance and wanted to do this webinar to try to share my excitement and share what the guidance says. And so with that, I'm going to leave this slide up for a second while I read these last two questions. Any follow-up questions, reach out to me. That's my email, and I'm happy to take those. Two questions. The one was, what if your school is year-round? And I think that was in relation to the ESY, and the guidance has been clear that, if you're year-round, you probably have big breaks, right? Or larger breaks between your quarters, and you could do ESY in those times, or you could get creative with after school or other times. Same for compensatory. If an LEA has already put recovery services in place, does this take the place of compensatory? So I did already answer that. So the answer, again, is unless those recovery services are specifically tied to the individualized analysis required under the law, under IDEA for compensatory, then probably not. So those were all the questions that I answered live. So I wanted to answer those again. It has been a real pleasure to do this again, and I hope that it was beneficial. And please, again, reach out if you have any questions at all.